to Tuesday Talks. And I'm going to take a minute here while people are logging in to make sure that we're streaming in all the places we need to stream. So bear with me 1 second. All righty, I think we are good. All right, welcome everybody to Tuesday Talks. And I am delighted this morning or evening to introduce some great colleagues who know a lot about this very nebulous topic that we have this week about institutional priorities or institutional goals. But before we kind of dive into the talk, I just want to go through some nuts and bolts while people are still logging in. As usual, we do have this streaming on a couple places, a couple platforms. So if you need Chinese translation, I'm going to share the screen so you can see the code here. Bear with me 1 second. Here we go. And there you go. So if you need Chinese, you can go on Xiaotong and get some Chinese support. Also, if for some reason Zoom isn't working for you, you can always go and try to see if you can watch it on YouTube. It's on there as well. And that way everybody can make sure that they still have a good connection, even if Zoom isn't cooperating with you today. But if you are on Zoom, I'm going to encourage you right now to open up your chat box, open up your Q&A box, because as usual, we want you to be engaged and asking questions. And this particular topic, we want questions right away because we know that it's kind of a hard topic to wrap your mind around. And so if we know kind of where you are in terms of your questions, we'll be able to fold that into the conversation since most of this is going to be Q&A today. We may or may not play Spot Mr. View today. So make sure you have your view on gallery view so you can see all the windows. And at some point, Mr. View may show up in one of the little boxes. So make sure you have your screenshot readiness, fingers ready. Take a screenshot and send it to contact@initialview.com and you'll get a prize. And finally, we just want to say special thanks once again to all of our sponsor schools. We couldn't be doing Tuesday Talks without you. So thank you so much for getting the word out to your students and families. And yeah, if you don't see the name of your high school on this list and you were like, I want our school to be a sponsor list, make sure you let us know because we would love for your school to be part of this so that all of your community isn't missing out on these great conversations. So, okay. And so without further ado, I would like to ask my friends here, if you could briefly introduce yourself and your institution. And we will start with Rick.
All right. Well, first of all, good morning, or as you said, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Gloria, the light is clearly shining on you, so I think this is going to be a very enlightened conversation. So looking forward to it. I did have one important question before we start, and that is, can panelists participate in the Mr. View competition here? And I did see that somebody put in chat, what do we do if we see? I'm sure someone will answer that, but essentially you screenshot it and send it to the email that someone will provide for you. So this is the most important thing. If you remember nothing else, like, you can get a prize. So we're glad you're here. Georgia Tech is also known as the Georgia Institute of Technology. It is in Atlanta, Georgia, which should be in the southeast part of the United States. It's probably the kind of predominant commercial banking, transportation capital of that region of the United States. But in terms of Georgia Tech, we have 6 colleges, 36 majors. So one thing that I guess is sort of different than a lot of other schools that you might hear from is we are not a comprehensive university. We don't do it all. We're more specialized in that sense. So, you know, the College of Engineering is a third of our majors. The College of Computing makes up about 25% of our students. And so in that regard, what you're going to find is that we're pretty STEM heavy. We do have liberal arts and all of this, but it's going to always be taught through a technology lens. And so that makes us a little bit different. All of our majors are Bachelor of Science rather than Bachelor of Arts, so a BS in. And really all that means is that you're going to have more technical training along the way, and sometimes higher number of course credits necessary to graduate. So the good news is we also have a website. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to tell you more about their institutions, but looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. And I'll hand it off to Mike.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Drish, and I'm with the University of Massachusetts Amherst. We are located about 2 hours outside of Boston in New England, so in the northeastern part of the United States. We're in a region of the country with a lot of colleges and universities. So if anyone is interested, you have the chance to visit a lot of places, including UMass. Like Rick was saying, we're a little different than Georgia Tech. We are a large, comprehensive university, hundreds of majors, 10 schools and colleges, students from hundreds of countries across the globe. So you have a great wide range of variety and mix here at UMass Amherst. And like Rick said, we have a website, we have great resources, videos online. I'll let you explore those, but really happy to be here today. I've worked in higher education for a little over 20 years, and many of those were actually in international admissions, have been to countries across the globe. So looking forward to the conversation today.
Wonderful, thank you. And Molly.
Hi, everyone. My name is Molly Murphy, and I'm the International Counselor in the Office of Undergraduate Admission at University of Virginia. University of Virginia is a medium-sized public research university in Charlottesville, Virginia. That's about a little over 2 hours from Washington, D.C., 1 hour from the Richmond area. We have a total undergraduate class of about 18,000 students. We do have about we do have 5 schools that directly admit first-year undergraduate students, as well as a few upper divisional schools that students can apply to later on. And each of those schools house a series of different academic majors. And you can obviously go on our website to find out more about the different options available at UVA. So happy to be here.
Wonderful. And I realized that I forgot to introduce myself as usual. My name is Gloria. I'm one of the co-founders of Initial View, host of Tuesday Talks. I think most of you probably know who I am, but thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And so before we kind of go into the topic, I always want to know who's here. And so I'm going to launch this poll right now. So hopefully you all see it. And if you could just let us know who you are. And I know it always takes a little bit of time to get engaged. So again, if you don't have your chat box open, go ahead and open it, because right after this poll, I'm going to ask you to type some things in the chat. And where people are participating, and yay, it looks like a lot of people are getting ready to apply very soon. So that's exciting. And quite a few of you are students, so that's great as well. Wonderful. Okay, so my first chat question of the day is going to be, how do you go about trying to understand what a college or university values? And this might be kind of a challenging question, but go ahead and start typing in what you do, or how you go about, or how you and your family, or if you're a counselor, have gone about to try to understand what a college or university values. And for those of you who participated in a Tuesday talk about FIT before, you might have already kind of heard about this. Great mission statement is a suggestion. We talked about values at a talk a few weeks ago, so that was a great place. Mission statement. Mission statement, yay, people are going to the same place. Mission statement. Browsing university websites or college websites, great. Yeah, see, read the mission statement. Everybody's talking about this mission statement that we should all know where it is. Looking for knowledge and culture. Great. Yeah, so a lot of people are saying mission statement. And asking alumni, that's a great great option. Current students, great. Wonderful. Okay, so the next chat question is, which parts of the college search and admissions processes are in your control? So the mission statement is probably not in your control. But what are some things that are in your control? Your academic performance and your grades, great. And as people are getting warmed up, it always takes a little bit of time for people to warm up on the chat. Okay, your essays, your extracurricular activities, your grades, the things that you do are in your control. Great. Okay, so this is a great frame of reference for me because it sounds like most of you kind of understand a lot of things about the holistic review process that exists in American admissions for many, many colleges. So we're going to talk about this thing that, like, some things that are in your control and some things that are not in your control. And we're going to spend some time kind of talking about which ones are which. But this whole nebulous vocabulary word that I have thrown out there in the title, institutional goal, or in some situations we might say institutional priority. And I think these are, they can be different things, they can be similar things. So I'm going to start off with like just the overarching, what is an institutional goal? And anybody can jump in right away.
Sure. Just I came off of mute more quickly than I expected, so I might as well go. Plus, I also answered my question. I don't think I'm eligible for spotting Mr. View because I tried to respond to the chat question and was unable to. So I assume that panelists are ineligible. Anyway, I think that ultimately an institutional goal is a little bit of what people said there before. Like, everything exists for a reason, right? I mean, a company has a purpose for existing. You're not going to see Nike serving a bunch of food. That's just not what they do. They make shoes, they make products, like they sponsor events. They don't produce food, at least not to my knowledge. And similarly, think about your own school. Like your high school exists for a reason. Whether it's a private or a public school, it exists for a reason, either to serve that community in that it's public, or as a private school, it has its own purpose and it tries to create its own culture. And that's exactly the same thing that happens on the college side, right? So an institutional goal is going to be that whatever that particular institution exists to do, it's trying to lean into and live out that mission. So just real quickly, Georgia Tech, we're a public school in the state of Georgia. That means first and foremost, and actually all three of these are public universities. And so first and foremost, we exist to serve the students of our state, right? And so you're going to usually see at a public institution the predominant number of students coming from that state. There are some exceptions to that, but largely across the country, what you find is that the higher percentage of students at public universities come from that state because they exist first and foremost to be a public good for that community, that region, that state, that city, et cetera. So, that would be at least one place to start the conversation.
I would agree with everything Rick said, and kind of to add on, a lot of people put in the chat, I think correctly so, a mission statement is a good way to kind of understand what a university values. That mission statement is usually adapted over the years because a big part of what we're doing right now has to do with who's leading the university. Admissions is one part of a bigger organization. And so what we end up doing in terms of selecting a class, in terms of where we recruit, how many students we could admit from different parts of the world, to different majors, will depend on a collaborative effort with our deans, the people who oversee our individual colleges or schools, our chancellors or presidents who oversee the entire university. Most universities have a board or a system-wide board that will make determinations like that. So as much as Molly and Rick and I would love to say, we'd like students like this to be this many at our campus, we don't usually get to have that say in that. So the makeup of our campus, the majors we offer, the amount of spaces in those majors, those are all priorities that are set by the board, president, chancellors, deans, people that we collaborate with, but it's not our decision individually. It's an institutional decision. And that's something that a lot of people sometimes think admissions has control over that, and we don't. We're more of the group that makes it happen, but others are involved in making those decisions, those priorities or goals, especially around enrollment.
So are there kind of these larger institutional goals coming from deans or, you know, the president that kind of change? Because Mike, you just mentioned that these things change over the years, but are there ones that kind of don't change, that students and families would be able to kind of know just from reading the mission statement or just from perusing your website? Are there ones like that, or is it something that is just always changing and always unpredictable?
Molly, you want to chime in, or?
I mean, I think for University of Virginia, kind of the larger goal of how the composition of our class, that is mostly going to stay the same. I mean, we are a public school in Virginia, so we have a commitment to serve the Commonwealth of Virginia, and we commit each year to enrolling about 2/3 of our undergraduate class from the state of Virginia, and then the other 1/3 come from the rest of the US and the world. But while our other institutional goals might change as kind of that leadership structure changes. Like, for instance, we just in recent years, we now have created a new office at UV. We have a vice provost of enrollment, and that Steve Farmer, and he and his office, they work with student financial services and the admission office and the registrar to kind of help determine those maybe newer goals. But the composition of our class, the 2/3 in-state, 1/3 out of state, that's largely going to stay the same.
Yeah, I would say that go ahead, Rick.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, a lot of times the big goals don't change that much. Universities want some group from outside the United States. They want, if a university has 100 majors, they want those 100 majors to have some number of students. It could just be some ups and downs or adjustments along the way. The amount of financial aid, whether or not a university gives financial aid to in-state, out-of-state, international students, where does that money come from? Are they able to continue that, increase it, decrease it over the years? So I think you're right, Gloria. It's kind of this notion that there are a lot of consistencies in the sense of, it's not as though a university is going to just say suddenly, if we have engineering, we don't want engineers, or we don't want a diversity in our class. We're going to make every effort to do that, but different boards or different presidents could put kind of a spotlight on it, or say, we want to increase this, or we have this new major, this new thing we're going to create. It's like Stanford just created a school of sustainability. And so it's kind of like, well, they're obviously going to put a big emphasis on getting students into that school because it's brand new. First time in like 25 years, they've created a school. So that's an institutional priority that could come about as new majors are developed and what kind of the makeup of that major may be. But I think you're right. That's where the ebb and flow occurs, is different leadership preferences or the university's movement over time, but rarely do some of those consistencies, like especially Molly alluded to, in-state, out-of-state, different breakdowns like that seem to stay relatively consistent over time, but could change as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would kind of along the lines, what I was going to say too is, to that point, like a president might come in and make some tweaks, and you can, he or she will put their own fingerprint on the direction of the school, but it's not like a 180 by any means. The core mission stays the same, but presidents and boards come in and they want to put their new strategic plan in place. And so when you were asking earlier, like, how do you determine maybe what a school is all about, I always think, like, what do they lead with? It's kind of like, in a newspaper, not that these things exist anymore, but on a website or an article, like, you lead with what you want people to remember, and what are they proud of? So whether it be in alumni magazines, sometimes in student newspapers, or just like if you listen to an admission talk, like, what are they leading with? Or if they only have 30 minutes, like, what are they spotlighting? So what are they proud of? And then two, I think sometimes on the alumni magazines, like, where's the money? You know, if there's to Mike's point, a new building, a new program, a new endowed, whatever it might be, those are the things that the money's flowing into and they're proud of. Like that's, you can probably tell that's going to be an institutional priority.
Yeah. Well, you know, our audience is pretty much all international, mostly international. So, you know, hearing these things about like, you know, public institutions having to serve their states is a little bit challenging. So, what does an international family do with that? Like in terms of thinking about your institutional's goal priorities in terms of student makeup, and how, you know, how does that kind of impact their choices? Like, why would an international student want to go to a public university if that's the case, if it's too hard to get into or whatnot? You know, do you have any thoughts on that?
You know, the good news is that most of the universities that enroll the largest number of international students in the US are public universities. So while we're talking about this different breakdown and what our goals are, the good news is, kind of like Molly said, a third of UVA being outside of Virginia is still thousands and thousands of students. It's not 10. And so you are applying for a large number of seats in many cases. And there are public universities bigger than the three of us on this meeting that are, you know, really enroll, you know, upwards of 50,000, you know, 60,000 students. And so there are a lot of seats available. So it's good to know the percentages because every state will be different. There are some states in the US that are very small and have a small population. So they need the majority of their students to come from outside of their state. But then there are other states where there are some limitations on the percent that can come from outside of that state, but it's still a sizable number. So the percents are one helpful piece, but getting a sense of what's that volume look like behind that. And then just like what we're talking about, and is that a campus that is welcoming and embracing of students from outside the US? I think on the whole, most US universities are pretty good at this or are trying to do this, but they will vary. And some universities may be new to enrolling international students, and it doesn't mean that they don't want to do it well, but it still could be a bit of a different setting than a place that's been enrolling thousands of international students for 40 or 50 years. So as long as you know that going into it and go, oh, I want to be a part of a place that is embracing this, is I get to affect change and help develop the resources, good to know. But if you're saying, ooh, I don't know if I want that, then you might want to find a place that has been doing that for a long time and has a great kind of resource system in place. So those would be the big differences, would be thinking about the volume and the percent and whether or not that university has been doing this for a while or is new to that. You'll get all of those different categories in the US.
Real quick, because I want to hear what Molly has to say about this, but I just, two things. I 100% agree with all of that. It's a great point about percentages. And then I think somebody might be sitting here thinking, well, where do I find that? I mean, just ask, right? I mean, just ask. Or if you want to do some digging or some homework, I mean, you could go and look. Sometimes schools will break that down on their profiles of the new class. They may say, you know, they might demographically break it down and say the X percent are from abroad. Or even from certain countries. But common data sets, especially, I know there's a lot of counselors on the call, like common data sets, I'm sure people are already on to that. But, you know, I think that that's another good place to go to figure out, like, okay, what percentage of this group are from abroad, or specifically countries, where are they from? Or institutional research pages of, if you really want to get inside baseball, you could go to institutional research pages and find out by country. And then the only other thing I was going to say is thinking about institutional priorities, like, you know, that's a great question to ask is, am I seeing, or is it evident that taking care of international students is an institutional priority? And Mike was kind of all around that in his response, but I think like framing it that way is a good question. If I'm coming from the US and, you know, going abroad for college myself, I'm asking that question. Like, I've heard of this school. It seems like they have a major I'm interested in, but like, am I going to just get thrown in and not really have a community there for myself, which goes to the numbers, or find myself in a place where they're going to understand the challenges and needs and support necessary to take care of somebody who's not from that particular place. So I think those are good ways to ask it, and ties into this conversation. But Molly, it's all you.
Yeah, and I also think I just want to echo what's already been said. As public universities, a lot of our admission data is going to be available publicly online. So if you want to do a deep dive into, at UVA, it's called institutional research and analytics. You can go directly from our admission site to there if you really want to. You can really take a deep dive into, what the class looks like, but also usually just on our general admission info, we will provide breakdowns about what, class sizes and percentages. And, UVA actually has a smaller international student community. About 5% of our class each year is international. So that's about, 200 students in each year, a little over. So that's also an important thing to think about, whether for international students, you want to be in a school that has a very large community, or if you're okay being in a school with a smaller international community. I think there are pros and cons to both situations. So that's just also something to be aware about when looking at universities and their class breakdowns.
Yeah. And I mean, you all already started answering this question, but my next question was like, well, how does someone even know where to look? And I think it's overwhelming, particularly, I think for international students, people are told like, oh, there are 4,000 institutions in America, and they're like, okay. And so obviously the first place that people go in most international realms is some form of rankings, right? Whether it be US News or QS and so, with that in mind, what is your advice or recommendation on how to find stuff? Like, do the rankings help? Do the rankings give you that sense of what the institutional priorities or the breakdown or not? And someone here is asking a question about, are the institutional priorities affected by the rankings? Like, how much does that play into a president's decision about how, something should be done that year? So that's kind of two questions. The first question, let's start with the first question of like, where do you go other than the rankings? Where do you go to kind of get this data? Because there is a lot of data out there, but like students and families are not AI machines, and they're not able to kind of dig through the data quickly. So what is your recommendation on how to kind of find information to be able to determine whether or not it's a good place?
Happy to kick us off here. I'd say kind of two things come to my mind. All of the organizations that have kind of summaries of our institutions, be it Princeton Review, College Board, you name all of these organizations that usually have like a little blurb about a university. That is a collaborative effort, putting that information together and providing it to these third-party American organizations. So I would start there because they don't give us much space. And so we have to be intentional about what do we say with these 200 words. And so if you go to Princeton Review or the College Board Big Futures site or whatever it may be, you'll get a sense of where we've chosen to really focus what we want to say about our institution. The biggest problem with our web pages is no one controls them. And so we can say all we want all day long, and it can be a lot of content. But those third-party organizations, as long as they're kind of legitimate and you can work with us or others to kind of identify those, or your college counselor, if you're in a school that has that resource, to help ensure you're also on a legitimate site that is an effort where we've provided that information versus someone is just saying it about us. Those are two big differences. On our own webpage, one place I would start would be on the main homepage of a university. There's usually an about us or something that's kind of a general page. Sometimes it could be the president's page, or the chancellor is another person in charge of university. A lot of times their webpage will highlight a lot of things Rick was talking about. Where are they investing their money? What have they received recently? Where are they focusing their efforts? Starting there, it's usually a page that doesn't get a lot of traffic, but it will tell you a lot about a university because it's what the president or the person in charge cares the most about. And that is usually where it all starts. Just like kind of the question there, if it's rankings, you're going to see rankings all over that page. If it's research, you're going to see that. If it's student life and student success, you're going to see that. And right there, that will tell you a lot about where the priorities start.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Gloria, there's 4,000 schools in America. And if you literally just like, somebody should create this like a roulette wheel where you just like can like spin all the names and then just like hit stop, you know, and then just like find a random college. If you did that 3 times and you just put those 3 screens up, just like what Mike said, you would see exactly what he's talking about. You know, I mean, I'm just thinking about schools close to us in Atlanta. If you put up Agnes Scott, which is an all women's small school, I mean, back to what Molly said earlier, like 200 first year, I think you said this, Molly, 200 first year international students at UVA. Well, maybe that's not a big percentage, but hey, that's like I think like a third of Agnes Scott's whole first year class, right? I mean, so you're gonna and what they're gonna talk about, their excitement around like developing women as leaders and student success and all of this. There's no doubt that's going to be predominant on the Agnes Scott site. Now you go to Georgia State University, right down the street from Georgia Tech, and it's you're talking about 60,000 students, and they're going to be really leaning in towards social mobility, and how they really do a great job of helping students who don't come from means move up in the sort of socioeconomic ladder and give kids opportunities. Yeah, sure, everybody kind of talks about that, but you can see Georgia State really leaning in to that as something they're proud of. So I think that's exactly right, and a big part of how you figure out how schools vary and maybe what resonates with you too.
Yeah, wonderful. And my second part of that question was, do rankings play into the institutional priorities?
Yes. I mean, they exist for a reason. I mean, unless a university doesn't participate in them, the rankings, and one thing I would challenge our audience to do is you can learn what goes into the rankings. And there are a lot of different rankings out there. And so, but there are very few universities that do not highlight their rankings in a brochure, on a web page. And right there, they want to highlight it. And if they're highlighting it, a president or a board is paying attention. And usually they're paying attention to that. But what goes into that ranking is almost as important as whether or not you're top 10, top 50. So what's that measuring? Because that's the part that's helpful, because as you start to get to know universities, you'll look at this and go, oh, that's why these universities are higher in that ranking, because they're measuring this and that. And when I looked at their page, they were really doing a lot of that. But these other places are doing really good stuff, but it's just not how the ranking's measuring it. So yes, it's absolutely a part of an institutional priority. I could tell you, having worked at a few universities, if for some reason a university was slipping in the rankings, there isn't a president or a board that wouldn't say, all right, what do we need to do to slow this down, to stop this? And it would become priority 1 for a university and an admissions office in ways that we could play a role. But the good news is a lot of places are doing pretty well, especially that everyone on here is looking at, like right now, UMass, Georgia Tech, UVA, we're all in good places. We're strong brands. We draw a wide range of students. So we're not as susceptible to that, but there are other universities in the US that might be a little more focused on that than some more established places.
So we talked a little bit about, what is in your control and what's not in your control. And so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that in more detail. Like, are there situations where a student or a family should be intentionally trying to find an institutional priority that they could fit into? And is there something that can be controlled in that section of, you in your job as admissions people? You are obviously looking at the quality of the student and the potential success of the student, but you also have these other things. And are there times where that overlaps, where a student does kind of have control, or a family does kind of have control, or not control, but at least some sense of like, oh, I should probably apply there because I would fit into that current institutional priority.
I can start off. I mean, I think first that, you shouldn't try to, make yourself fit into a place. You should really first be thinking, oh, is this a good fit for me? And I think it's important to understand that, a university's values are probably going to inform maybe what you see on the application in terms of maybe supplemental essay questions. For instance, at UVA, we're really big on student self-governance, collaboration. Those are informed by our values, by our history. And you will notice that a lot of our supplemental essay questions on the Common App are going to be, based on those values. So just going into an application, I think it's really important to have that understanding.
Yep. I think that's a great point. That's another place you can see, again, what are people proud of or what are they interested in? Those supplemental questions are sometimes a good tell into institutional priorities. And I think the answer is yes and no, right? I mean, yes, there are some things that probably make sense to consider. For instance, you could look at a school who has a really high early decision admit rate. And that probably does speak to a couple of things we've been talking about already. I mean, that they may be trying to, either lower their admit rate or just guarantee their class or hold their money. I mean, there's lots of different reasons why schools may kind of lean into early decision as a strategy that plays out in a lot of this. Now, knowing that a school has a high ED admit rate or even a lower profile of students in ED, does that mean you apply ED to that school if it's not really your first choice and you're not that interested? No. If UVA hasn't enrolled a kid from North Dakota in 3 years, do you move there? Like, I mean, you could control that. Like, you could actually do that, but is that something that you really are willing to do? I mean, so yes and no, I think is the answer. I mean, if a school has a high ED admit rate and a lower profile within that, and that is your first choice, well, yeah, you should apply ED there, but you should have done that anyway, right? You're just aware maybe that seems to be, quote, an institutional priority. Or, similarly, but conversely, you don't, or actually, let me just say back to supplemental questions. Let's say a kid is applying to the University of Massachusetts and to UVA and to Georgia Tech, and they're legitimately interested. They found them to be good matches, and that's very possible that a kid could look at all three of these schools on the call today. What they write for that supplemental question, or maybe even like what they prioritize a little bit, let's say in an interview and talk about for that particular school could vary, knowing, let's say that for us, entrepreneurship, right, is a big thing. Well, you could be a person who is, doing that kind of thing, interested in that kind of thing, and has a story to tell about that kind of thing. And for Georgia Tech, you might lean more into it, knowing the research you've done that lends more towards it. Whereas, for whatever Mike and Molly and the content around those schools have been saying to you, yes, you have that entrepreneurial bent, but for one of them in an interview, in a conversation, in something you're going to highlight on that part of their application, their supplemental pieces, then you might lean more into that. So I think that's where it's a yes and no kind of answer for institutional priorities.
I think a good example of this too is kind of what you, in the piece of what can you do or how could this work? A lot of it has to do with how universities are structured in the US. I think I'll use an example of like just Georgia Tech and UMass. Like, we both have engineering, we both have computer science, but how we structure that could be very different. Like at UMass, computer science is its own college, and you can't switch from engineering into computer science. But at other universities, computer science is in the engineering school, and you could switch majors into that. So it's kind of those things where that's going to affect our priorities, because we know that we shouldn't admit someone if they want computer science to another area because they couldn't switch into it. Whereas you could apply to another university and you might get admitted to computer engineering, but it's all in the same college. So they know you could eventually switch into it. So though that's the homework you want to do as well, because what I just said there is so confusing. Like, it'd be so nice if every US university had the same academic kind of micro sections. You know, it's like we all treat engineering this way, we all treat business this way, but we don't. And so, and that's a challenge because it's hard for Americans to get a grasp of that. And it's even harder for students who haven't had experience with that system. But that's a great example of, you want to do that. And again, that will tell you something about the university and how to maneuver that process so that you're not surprised how it could be a very different experience in one place versus another. And again, that's beyond our control. How universities are structured is a professor faculty level decision. It's usually their preferences. It's not the admissions office. It's not us intentionally trying to make it difficult for people. It's really comes down to those teaching how they want to be grouped together. And so it's not anything more complicated than that, but it is hard because there are every different version of it at university. So taking some time to really understand that will give you a little more ability to control what you may or may not be able to do at that university.
Yeah, thank you. So there are a couple of questions that are kind of a little bit school specific, and I want to address them kind of more broadly and encourage people to go to these individual institutions' own like school visits, tours, and sessions if you have some more specific questions. But in terms of institutional priorities and being controlled, not controlled, that's too strong, but like being dictated by state requirements and things, testing is like a big question, for, especially in a new kind of test optional, test free world. There are still institutions that need tests, and that may be coming from the state. So just wanted to ask for any clarification and weigh in on how to kind of approach that, think about that, especially for an international student who's considering applying to a public institution that might still require tests.
I guess it makes sense for me to answer that question, at least to start anyway. Given that Georgia Tech, as part of a larger system, happens to be 25 other public universities in our state, our Board of Regents, which governs all of those schools, has said that yes, testing is required to be submitted as part of a complete application for review, and I don't think that's going to change next year. So it was the case this year. I believe that will be the case next year as well. They did make a bit of a pivot on that late this year for a couple of the public schools in our system, but for Georgia Tech and most of the others, I think that this will continue to be the case. So I guess the upside of that is there's no mystery, there's no lack of clarity. I mean, you need to send in an SAT or an ACT in order to be considered for admission. I would say probably now more than ever, when we talk about a holistic review and testing being just one of many factors, that's never been more true in how we look at applications. So do they matter? Yeah, on some level, certainly they matter. But it's never going to be the primary thing. My best analogy of this is just like a stool or a table where you have multiple legs bearing weight, and everybody decides what the legs of those stools or tables are going to be. So one school is going to say, GPA only, like your grades and the courses you take, and that is just going to hold up the entire stool or table. Others are going to say, well, it's testing and grades, or they're adding more legs to that and saying it's the stuff you do outside the classroom, it's your essays, it's your interview. They're just adding legs. And so I think that's the big thing for a student to consider is, what are they telling me they're going to review and look at, and if that whatever else they add to this equation essentially is going to hold weight. Now, are those legs all the same width and, supporting the same amount of weight? Probably not. Again, this is not something I think students need to be particularly concerned about. They can listen for what admission officers say, but they know that all those things are, quote, required and are going to be reviewed. And I don't think it's worth their time or energy trying to determine which one exactly holds more weight and matters more. You do your best possible job on all of them, send them what they need, and let them make the decisions.
Adding to what Rick shared, just from kind of the non-Georgia perspective, very few admissions offices get to decide what's required or not. So again, back to what we talked about earlier, I would love it if we in our office could sit and say, these are the things we'll require, but it's usually the faculty or professors, campus leadership, board systems, whatever it may be that plays a role in that. And so the reason I say that is it can be very frustrating. There could be a number of you watching today that are planning to apply to enter our universities in August 2023 or maybe August 2024. And for some of us, we haven't made a decision on standardized testing, whether or not it will be required beyond a few years. We're all living in a very unpredictable environment right now. And I wish we could give a little more predictability to that, but that's something that's beyond just the admissions office's control in most cases. Like you heard Rick say, that was a 29 system board decision that was made. At UMass, and I'll let Molly share, it's a local control decision, but it still involves our president, our faculty, senate, and then we just give some advice on it. And we need them to meet and make that decision, and hopefully they will this fall. But if anyone were looking at our site, it's going to say we're test optional through starting in fall 2023. So if you're a group that would start in fall 2024, we don't mean to create anxiety around that. It's just that we will have a decision in the next few months. And I know there's challenges there with the availability of tests in different parts of the world, and it gives you limited time. We try to convey that as best we can to the people that make this decision. And sometimes it just works well, and other times they take longer. So know that if a university hasn't made that decision, it's not that we don't value or in many cases understand the situation. It's just there's so many competing priorities on the people who are making those decisions that they're trying to get to it, and they'll get to it as soon as they can. But back to that idea of like, what do we value? I can tell you every institution that maybe hasn't made a decision on standardized testing, or I think Rick would say this, obviously Georgia universities value international students. It's not that they don't want you to be there. It's just this is a requirement that they've made with a whole host of other reasons in mind. And so back to that value conversation, if we require testing or not, we're aware of some of the limitations and challenges around that. And just like I think Rick said really well, it's one leg of a multi-leg stool. Those are key things to keep in mind and things to ask us about, but it will vary kind of who gets to control that decision.
Yeah, and I think I can just reiterate, same with University of Virginia, we've extended test optional through this upcoming application cycle, but we just don't know beyond that because it's not our decision alone. And I think for the application process in a whole, it is going to unfortunately vary some year to year. Our supplemental requirements might change based on based on our goals or what's happening in admission and other offices in the university. So I think it's just important to be flexible and realize that it may change a little bit from year to year.
Well, before I dive into the very philosophical question that I want to ask, I do want to make the audience, aware that we just have 10 more minutes. So if you have questions that you haven't asked yet, you should definitely put them in the Q&A right now. But my kind of philosophical question is this fair? It's like a big, hard, nebulous question. But yeah, is it fair? And how do we deal with a system that we can't necessarily see? Of course, Mr. View had to show up when I'm trying to talk about something really serious. But joking aside, is there, what are your thoughts about the fairness of institutional priorities, and what a family should do with that? We want people to have participated in this conversation because, well, for me as a parent to really kind of help my own children say, like, your value is not necessarily in whether or not you get into a school, because there are some things out of your control. But, at the same time, I'm a mother who really wants the best for their child and feels like you deserve something, you deserve this. So, speak to a little bit about the fairness, and what a family can kind of do as they approach this process.
Maybe I'll kick us off real quick. I mean, I think is college admission fair? 100% no. It's not how it's set up, and we exist for a purpose, though. That's what institutional priorities are all about, right? Each institution was created for a reason and to live out a particular mission. That is the beauty and sometimes the confusion of American higher education. It is different than almost any other country in the world. But what I would tell people, and when I've traveled abroad and really even just domestically as well, like, that's also the beauty of American higher education, is that it is diverse. If you want to go to school in this country, you're going to have a lot of options, and there is going to be not just one place for you, but many places for you. And that, I think, points back to the student. This is the opportunity that students have in the college admission experience, and that is to really ask good questions about who they are, what they want, why they're going to college, and to be really, clear and honest about that. If they'll do this, then that roulette wheel that's spinning with 4,000 schools, plenty of options are going to be coming up, right? And the last thing I'll say to your point, Gloria, is as a parent and as a counselor, and I know there's many of both on this call today, I think one of the best messages that those two constituency groups can be saying to any applicant is, that the way that admission decisions are made is not the way that they ultimately sometimes land or feel to a student, right? It's kind of like how people say, like, sorry, not sorry. It's sort of like personal, not personal. It feels so personal because you pour yourself into writing an essay, doing an interview, taking the time and effort to submit this application. It feels like you're putting yourself out there. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think we all want to be wanted, right? And so if we're doing a good job of being honest with ourselves about the places we think will fit and match, you're going to end up with good choices and good options. Bottom line, that's the goal. Not going to a particular place, but ending up with choices and options when it's all said and done. And that, again, is where I think America really shines in terms of the way this whole process sort of does ultimately work. But no, it's not fair. We had twins the other day who are appealing because one was admitted and one was not, right? And those decisions made a ton of sense. It hurts on the family level, and I get that. Like you're saying, as a parent with two kids, I can appreciate what that must feel like, that to feel like these are getting pulled apart, right? But that's not how admission decisions are made. We make admission decisions for the good of our institution, period.
Anything else to add?
And I also think it's important to remember that, institutional goals, they're not designed to serve like individuals. They're meant to serve the community, either the university community or the larger surrounding community. And so, what's in your control when researching different universities is really taking the time to understand what that community is like and deciding, if that's going to be a good fit for you.
Yeah, all well said. Nothing else to add.
All right, well, we have a little bit of time, and there's a few questions in here that I want to try to address, and I'm trying to see if I can fold some of these together. Back to holistic review, and review, and we talked about, if you have priorities, like we need a certain percentage of this type of person, like, do you view the applicants in their pools, within their pools, like, oh, we're just going to look at international students this way, or students from China this way, or Asian students in this region this way. Like, do you compare that way? Or, we've had other sessions where people talk, we review by school. So you're looking at the context of your school. Are you looking at the context of populations ever?
Happy to kick us off. I think that it will depend on the institution. For example, I think for a large public university, a lot of times the key things, the read itself may be in the context of, if anything, the major or the school or college a student selected. And a lot of the other pieces are kind of secondary or ancillary, like what you were talking about, Gloria. I would think about, like, at UMass, if someone were applying to engineering, a great example is we read to look to see if they had a chemistry or a physics or what's their highest level math. All the other pieces you mentioned are so secondary to that. That's really not on the reader's mind. Are they Asian or not? Are they from this state or this country? That's kind of secondary. It's a contextual piece, but it's not driving their decision. And Molly said this really well. So the reader reads the application, rates it or makes a recommendation. Then when it's time to select, we're looking big picture at, okay, we can have X% of our admitted students from outside the US. Now let's look big picture. Back to that, it's not always an individual decision. It's looking at it like that. And these are the eligible students. And so a lot of times the readers are not taking all that into account unless the student really draws attention to that. If a student chooses in their essay to talk about their identity, or if they choose through activities to highlight ways that they've really embraced their community, which happens to be rural or small town versus big city, then those things will play a role. But if they don't, it's whatever they've chosen to highlight. So I think that's a big part of that. Sometimes those different pools will vary as to, does the reader consider them, or is it when we're selecting who to admit, we're considering them? And in that sense, it's a broader review, not an individual review.
Yeah, I mean, talking about international students in particular, back to this idea, I mean, for us, the number is 10%. I know Molly was mentioning about 5%, right? So in that sense, it's both, right? You could read by country and by school. And so, for instance, because you're looking for particular target numbers ultimately. And so you could have somebody that's reading, for instance, China, and regardless of the number of applicants, like, here's how many students we are ultimately looking to enroll from China this year. Well, if a student is in a different country, they're still going to be categorized or pulled into that overall China number, right? Because their citizenship is what is going to dictate, right? So they're competing in a way, not only within the school they are from or the context in which they're studying and evaluated as such, but they're also looked at sort of demographically too, in that regard. So I think it's a little bit of both. Somewhere in there, I feel like there's a good analogy about like oranges in a supermarket, but I'm just not ready to kind of come out with it yet. So I'll work on it.
Well, I feel like we should end on that. Oranges in the supermarket. I mean, there are other questions that we didn't get to, but these are great questions that you should be asking when you participate in all of the other sessions that you should be going to. And so I know that there were, again, school-specific questions, and there are individuals at these campuses who want to answer your questions, and we have international context for these specific institutions so that they can answer specific international related questions. And you should definitely reach out. And just before we close out, any words of advice from any of the three of you in a time when people are feeling pretty uncertain about a lot of things, what is your kind of, takeaway that you want to leave to the audience?
Happy to kick us off here. I think that the one thing I'd reiterate is working for a large public university in the US, we want to help you. We want to answer your questions. We will respond if you email us or you reach out to our offices. We don't want this to be intimidating. Like we said, there are things beyond our control, and we want to try to help make it easy to understand. We want to be transparent. We don't want to kind of fool you or make it so that it's confusing. So we're here to respond, to answer questions. There's no bad question. You're not penalized for asking a question. So please reach out to us. That's why we put the contact info on that slide. It's why it's on our sites. We really want to help you through this process so that you'll have some good choices in front of you. Even if it doesn't appear that way sometimes, that is our goal. So we're here to do that.
And I mean, I always say, no matter what the context of the conversation is, just, be true to yourself in the application process, write about, tell us about the experiences that inform who you are as a person and what's important to you. Again, that might, you might choose to emphasize different stories depending on the school, but it's really important to be true to yourself because that authenticity, that passion is going to shine through in the application.
Yeah, I mean, back to rankings real quick, I would just say that numbers, no one number is going to tell a complete story, right? Whether that be rankings or cost of a college or percentage of anything, right? And so I think that your job as an applicant, as a prospective college student, is to act like a college student. And that means doing your research, right? Asking tough questions, testing your assumptions, keeping an open mind. You should be growing and changing and not fixed as an applicant, right? So adaptability and willingness to take in a lot of information and figure out how that applies to you and how you can then apply it is the way you should be behaving. Like a good high school student and a good high school student who's applying to college makes ultimately a good college applicant by applying those type of qualities that make you successful in college and beyond.
Wonderful. Well, I just thank you so much, all three of you, for joining me tonight and this morning, or wherever you are. And it's been, I just appreciate your willingness to kind of talk about things in a more transparent way, and giving us vocabulary to learn how to ask good questions. So thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us. Thank you everybody for joining Tuesday Talks once more. We will be having a talk about essays next week. So if you are struggling with what to write about, this will be a good one to attend. And for those of you, my colleague is going to stay on for a little longer. If you have specific questions about initial view, she'll be talking a little bit about that. So you're welcome to hang on if you would like that. Otherwise, I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. And thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Hello.
Hello. All right. For those of you who are hanging on, we're going to be answering questions about initial view if you have questions about initial view. So if you do have questions about initial view, you should go ahead and start typing in the chat or in the Q&A, but also my colleague Jocelyn, who used to be an admissions officer at Swarthmore College and who's now one of our interviewers, she's going to talk a little bit about what's important about an interview and kind of how to prepare. And if you have questions on, what the process is, she's available. So yeah, so Jocelyn, take it away.
Thanks, Lara. Hello, everybody. I'm Jocelyn, current interviewer and former admissions officer. I have questions about initial view, how interviews work, how they work in relation to the admissions process. Can answer questions about any of those things. So start typing your questions in the chat or the Q&A box, and I will answer them in the order that they come in. Okay, so the first question I got is how long are the interviews usually? So, so for the most part, they hover around like the 15-minute mark. Some are a little bit longer. They might go on to like a 19, 20-minute conversation, and some are a little shorter. But for the most part, we try to do an interview that's around 15 minutes. And, the interviewer has a unscripted casual conversation with the student, and the goal is to really get the student to talk about or to think about the things that set them apart, right? Things they want to highlight about themselves for admissions officers to know. And we, as interviewers, we try to ask questions that dig a little deeper into their interests. We try to get the student to talk about things that really interest themselves. So yeah, it's a conversation that lasts about 15 minutes. And in addition to that conversation that we record and then send to the schools that students are applying to, there's also a 20-minute limited timed writing sample. So the student is given a prompt and is asked to write a short essay or a few paragraphs on this topic. And both of those things are included in your initial view interview when they are sent to one of the colleges that you are applying to. So that is sort of the very basic kind of summary of what an initial view interview entails. Okay, any other questions about the interview, how it works, how admissions officers look at it, the process? Feel free to drop them here. Okay, so there's a question. When you were an admissions officer before, did you watch the entire interview video or normally just watch the part selected by students? So to give you a little bit of context of how the interview shows up for admissions officers. So for most of us, many of us admissions officers, we use a platform called Slate. It's our CRM for processing and reviewing all applications. And we usually have sort of a window up, and then on the left, you have a column of all these different sections of an application, right? So you have the personal information, you have the transcripts, you have the recommendation letters, and then additional information, all those things. And then initial view usually is one of those tabs in that column. And my habit, and honestly, after I connected with a lot of different admissions officers from different colleges, many of us, our habits is go in once we open up a file, and then we start with the initial view tab, we go into it and just click play on that video, right? So I enjoyed doing this because I could hear the student's voice as I'm reviewing an application. And also a lot of times the interview video gives me context for the things that I'm seeing in the application, right? A lot of times if I have certain questions about the student, they happen to be talking about it in the interview. So it's always helpful for me to hear the student's voice, feel like I'm having a conversation with them as I'm reviewing a file. So for the most part, by the time that I'm, going through an application, by the time I finish reviewing it, I will have gone through the majority of that interview video. And your question also includes, do you watch the whole interview or just the part selected by the student? So a student does not get to select a certain part of the video. What initial view does is that we do put timestamps on your interview video of each question that is asked and answered by you. So the admissions people can go in and click on different sections of your interview based on which questions they want to see you answer. And another neat part is that another thing that initial view does is that they highlight a certain question that a student answers because, they think that it's a particularly thoughtful answer, or that it's very, that would be very informative for the admissions officer. So there is sort of a highlighted section for the admissions officers always. which is super helpful, right? Because, me as a admissions officer, if I'm going in and, and I see that, initial view thought that the student had a particularly compelling answer to this question, and then it helps me sort of get to that part, or to really pay more attention to that section. So for the most part, I would say, yes, admissions officers will watch the majority of that interview. Whenever there is an initial view interview, I will always click on it. I will always watch it, because it's always helpful for me, and it always provides additional context and information that I find helpful in my admissions review. And then, no, a student does not get to select a certain part of the interview. You do, when you choose to have an interview sent to different admissions offices, you are choosing for that entire video to be sent and not just specific sections. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so there's another question of what usually are the questions that interviewers ask. So I think what is different and what is unique about the initial view interview is that it is an unscripted conversation. And that's one of the major goals is to have a natural, unscripted conversation that really shows how a student engages with another person in a discussion, right? So as a former admissions officer, what was helpful to me is to really imagine having the student in a classroom setting. And particularly, to the institution that I worked at that really had small class sizes, the focus was on discussion-based conversations. I really wanted to see how the student would engage with other students in maybe a 5-6 student classroom, right? In a seminar with a professor. So I think one of the major goals of an interview with initial view is to really replicate that for admissions officers, right? And that's why we don't really script our questions going into it. As an interviewer, I don't, walk into an interview knowing the kinds of questions that I'll ask. I might have, an initial, question to get the student started, in talking, to get the conversation going. But then all of my questions are really dependent on the kinds of answers that the student provide for me. So if they tell me that they're interested in particular things, and then I will go ahead and sort of dig a little deeper into that, ask additional questions or second tier questions to get them, walk me through the details, provide examples. But I'm not prepared with a set of questions or a list of questions. And what really, that sort of, formal interview of like question, answer really doesn't happen with initial view. So no, there are no scripted questions for interviews. And really it is to get the student to talk about things that they want to highlight for the admissions officers. So how many schools, right? How many schools can you send your interview video to, and does it cost more when you send it to more schools? So you can send it to, as many schools as you would like. There is additional cost for each school that you send your interview to, but you can send it as many as, however many that you would like for schools to see your interview. And that process is pretty easy. So once you do an interview with initial view, and then we process it, and then we let you watch your video before, we need sort of an okay from you that you're happy with that and you would like to use that for your admissions purposes. And then you can select the schools that you want this video to be sent to. And when you say yes to that, it also includes your 20-minute writing sample. It will be sent to the schools as a package. And like I said, it will just show up on for those admissions officers reader as they review applications. That's one of the tabs on the left. Okay, so we're about 5 minutes short of this little Q&A section. So you do have more questions, put them in the chat. And just a reminder, we do have this Q&A portion about initial view, about interviews after every Tuesday talk. So if you do have questions later on, you can always come back to one of the Tuesday talks and just stay after the talk itself. Okay, so I'm not seeing more questions come in. So hopefully that means that you don't have a ton of questions for initial view. But if you do have more, like I said, we can always come back to the Tuesday talks in the following weeks. But thank you so much for doing this. Everybody have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, and take care. Bye-bye.